Yeah, our topic is indirect taxes and subsidies for today. So, are you ready? Let's show some excitement. Okay. Again, don't worry too much about this. So, this is kind of like which syllabus covers what types of things. So, I'm trying to focus on the things that are overlapping in each syllabus. So, most of it, or certainly nearly all of it, would be relevant to you. So so indirect taxes and subsidies. First, of course, want to know what taxes are, right? So have you ever met this guy? I don't think you guys have met him yet, because you guys are probably students and haven't really paid income tax before to the government. So this is the tax man. He's not very friendly, but he'll take your money legally, and he doesn't need to hide in plain sight like Superman, and he shall take what is his. So there are two types of taxes that the taxman aims to take. So we've got direct taxes and indirect taxes. So direct taxes are just taxes that are taken directly from what you earn. So let's say if you make like $5,000 a year, the government might take 10% of that, which is $500 from your salary, and that would be a type of direct tax. Yeah, so we're just trying to get the pointer out. So if there are any taxes on your incomes or even on profits, then that would be direct taxes. Or if you rent out your backyard or your property, that would also be direct taxes. Whereas indirect taxes are taxes being paid when you're buying or selling a good and service. So I'm not sure if you know, but if you buy cigarettes or cooking oil in ancient Rome, you're actually paying part of the money you've spent to the government. So let's say if a pack of cigarettes, shouldn't do commercial for cigarettes, but so a pack of cigarettes is like $5, and the $5 that you've paid, there might be like $1, which is like going to the government. Yeah. So indirect taxes are taxes taken when you buy or sell a good or service. So in many cases, many people don't even realize that indirect taxes exist, because it's all accounted in for the price of the good. Yeah. So in the past, we used to have property taxes on the number of windows that our houses have. So let's say if you own a nice Victorian house, not sure if this is Victorian style, but I think it's good enough. So the more windows you have on your Victorian styled house, the higher taxes you had to pay for your property. So, and that, I think that kind of tries to estimate how big your house is, right? So supposedly if you've got a bigger house and you've got like more windows, then you've got to pay like higher taxes in the past. But of course, what happened is that this caused constructors or like builders to not build windows in houses so that they can evade the tax, and eventually it's led to poor hygiene conditions and poor living conditions, and that's why the taxes on windows are scraped or scrapped, whatever you call it. Yeah. Okay, so just some interesting history there. So actually you're paying indirect taxes for nearly everything you buy, especially if you live in the UK. And that's because we've got VAT. So for those of you that aren't in the UK, you might not be very familiar of what a VAT is. VAT stands for Value Added Tax. So on most goods and services, the government is actually taking 20% of the price that the good is charged at. So if the good is charged at $10, if you're buying like a fidget spinner or something, so this is kind of like a fidget spinner, a very poor one, then essentially you'd be paying like $2 for the $10 that you've spent, or for the £10 that you've spent. But there are some exemptions. So normally it's 20% in the UK, but there are exemptions like child seats, home energy, or food and children's clothes, things like that. So you can see this funny comic here. Dear Granny, thanks for the gift voucher. Due to the fat increase, you need to send me more money. Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, so next. So indirect taxes makes a good more expensive, obviously, because it causes a fall in the supply in the market. And this is because producers see less of an opportunity to make a profit by selling the good. Yeah. If you can imagine, if you're the seller of a fidget spinner that we previously discussed, then what we have is we've got to pay taxes, right? So let's say if we've charged $10 again, and we've paid $2 in taxes. Ooh, $10 again, and then we've paid $2 in taxes. So taxes. Then the price of our good is higher, right? Because I could have charged $8, but still made the same amount of profits. So I could have charged $8 instead of 10 to make the same amount of profits, yeah? So essentially, indirect tax is generally bad for business. And because I'm making less profits and I have to charge more in order to account for the indirect tax, suppliers would tend to leave the market, or they might tend not to enter into the market if there is a tax. And as a result, this would shift supply to the left. Yeah. So here we see some pubs asking the government to reduce the beer duty, especially during the times of coronavirus, where everyone is hesitant in getting a drink at the pub. And yeah, so this definitely affects their profit margins, and it might actually make business less sustainable for them. Another thing to understand is that the tax is actually shared, yeah, between the consumer and the producer. So what I mean by that is, say if we go back to the fidget spinner, so if you charge $10, essentially the consumer wouldn't be paying anything because you're paying like the $2 tax. But instead, what you can do is that you can charge a higher amount. So if you charge $11, and then as a result, you might need to pay like 2.3 tax or something like that. But then you would have got more revenue or got more profits from the higher price. So essentially, you're kind of passing on the tax burden to the consumer because you're charging the consumer more in order to help pay the tax. Yeah. So suppliers can always increase their prices in order to share the tax between the consumer and the producer. So I'm not sure if all of you are fans of economic diagrams, but if you're just tuning in, then you can feel free to take this lightly and don't need to worry too much about it. But if for those of you studying A-level or IB economics, you might not have learned this yet, but it would be good to listen in. So generally, we've got like the demand curve and the supply curve. And normally, if we charge a low price, for example, if the price is here, then of course we'll be able to demand a lot of the good because it's cheap and a lot of people would buy it. So there'll be a lot of quantity. So on the other hand, again, if there's like a very high price, then people would supply a lot of the good. So in general, we would operate at the point where the supply is equal to demand in the market. So we're talking about these points here. Yeah. So when there is a tax that is being levied, supply would decrease because people are making less profits. And as a result, the businesses would leave the market. So therefore, we would see the supply curve shifting to the left. So shifting to the left would be a decrease because as you can see here, there'd be a decrease in quantity of the number of that product sold in the market. And as a result as well, the price would go up if we change the curve from S1 to S in this case. Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's kind of how we would be able to explain it using economic theory. Similarly, we'll be able to show how the tax burden is shared between the consumer and the producer within a tax diagram. So we can see here that the market price has increased from P to PC. If we just, so this one here would be the market price. So PC is market price after tax. And then P is the original market price. So we can see in the diagram that the market price has increased, but essentially the consumer is kind of paying for all of this, right? Because the consumer might be now paying $12 instead of $10 for this fidget spinner because of the tax. However, the producer might also be taking part of the tax burden. So let's say, because if say the fidget spinner is $12, then 20% of $12 would be what? So we divide that by 5, that would be 2.4, right? So in this case, then the producer would be paying $0.4 here. So the consumer is paying like $2 in terms of tax, and then the producer is paying some tax as well out of their profits. And PP, this here, is essentially the price that the producer receives for selling each unit. Yeah. So in this case, because we've got $12 at the market price, $10 is the original price, and then if we subtract the $0.4, then the producer is receiving how much? Like $9.6, right? So I can just put it here. So $12 is the market price now. The original price is $10, and then the producer is receiving $9.6 for each fidget spinner sold. Okay, cool. So all of this is really just to illustrate that tax is kind of shared between the consumer and the producer, because the producer can charge more in order to pass on the tax to the consumer. Okay, cool. It's easy to kind of like mix up the top and the bottom as well if you are in exam conditions. So make sure to remember that the consumer tax burden is always on top, because the consumer is paying for the increased price in this case. So that's one way to remember it. But be careful, because it kind of switches around when it comes to subsidies. Okay. Okay, so we've explained that. Okay, so why tax? Why does the government want us to pay more money? So taxes can be good sometimes, and that's because when we reduce supply, what happens is that it can reduce our consumption of harmful substances. So if it's more expensive, due to the tax, we'll tend to buy less demerit goods or harmful goods. So you can think of things like alcohol or cigarettes. So these are kind of harmful to our body, right? And as a result, we will be able to kind of protect the consumers by levying a tax on a particular good or service. So this would help us reduce negative externalities, which we would cover tomorrow, and reduce market failure. So here we see the sugar tax. So this is quite popular, even in takeaways nowadays on Uber and like Just Eat. So you would have like sugar taxes on the soft drinks that you're ordering. So it is a bit of a hassle, but supposedly it should be able to reduce consumption of soft drinks and obesity, and that should save taxpayers a lot of money, and of course it should help improve our health as well. Okay, so why taxes? What are some of the bad effects of taxes? So some taxes, like the VAT, is what we call regressive. So what we mean regressive is that they tax the poor a larger proportion of their income than the rich. So at this point, let me give you an example. So let's say if you earn like £100, so let's use pounds. Okay, £100 each year. So that's kind of bad. But I guess for students, it makes sense for to earn £100 a year. It's justifiable. Or is that below the minimum wage? That's below the minimum wage. Okay, anyway, so if you earn £100 a year, compared to someone wealthy who is earning like £10,000 a year, and both of you goes to buy like a piece of bread or a piece of oven for £10, yeah. So because the oven is £10, with VAT included, it would be like £12, yeah, because VAT is 20%. So if both of us buy an oven, then we're paying a tax of £2, right? So as a percentage, we can see £2 is 2% of the poor person's income or poor student's income. So it takes up a lot of their income. But whereas £2 is what? 0.02%, right? Of a rich person's income. So we can see the VAT has got a much higher effect on the poor, or those that are earning less, because it's taking a lot more of their incomes compared to the rich. Yeah. So this means when we introduce a tax rate that is not progressive and that does not increases according to the income, we would be increasing relative poverty. So relative poverty means that you would feel that you're relatively poorer, and it kind of gets worse and worse because your living standards compared to the rich, the gap is getting greater and greater. So if the tax is regressive, we're kind of like increasing the difference in living standards even more. So of course, that is not very desirable for governments, because inequality tends to increase social conflict, and also it is an indicator, or it is correlated with happiness. So let's just put it that way. Okay, so all of that is a bit bad for indirect taxes that are regressive. So some indirect taxes might not be regressive. But however, of course, taxes, one function is to fund the government's finances. Yeah. So we can see taxman grabs $125 billion on VAT. Yeah. So it is a major source of income for the government to help provide us public goods and services. Yeah. Okay. So you might think that I really hate being taxed and I don't like having money taken by the government. Then what's some ways to take money from the government instead? How can we earn money from the government? So apart from being a civil servant, you can try to take advantage of what we call their grants and subsidies. Yeah. So grants and subsidies. These are some of like the grants that the UK government provides. So from Innovate UK. So if you're able to develop some type of energy efficient technology because the government wants to help tackle climate change, or if you're able to support psychological therapies using technology because mental health is becoming a greater and greater issue for us. So all of these innovative solutions, you can see that the government is actually trying to promote, and by doing so, we'll be able to supposedly raise our living standards or increase efficiency of the economy. So the government would try to subsidize some of the objectives that they're trying to achieve. So what are subsidies? Subsidies are funds provided by the government to increase production or consumption of a good or service. So if the government pays a grant for you to develop a COVID vaccine, then of course there will be more researchers working for that. since they'll be able to afford and cover their costs of the innovation and the research and development that they're doing. Okay, so how would you think subsidies will affect the price or quantity of a good in the market? So I'll give you maybe half a minute to think about this. You gotta choose wisely. So A, price would increase, but the quantity would decrease. B, price decreases, but the quantity increases. C, price increases and the quantity increases. And D, price decreases and quantity decreases. Okay, so we've got some responses. We've got B, 2 B's. Okay, so we don't have the dramatic music just yet because we're not at Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But yeah, so B is correct. Yeah. So price would decrease and the quantity would increase. And that's because we would shift the supply to the right when we receive a subsidy. So there'll be more suppliers, and as a result, we'll be producing more of the good, and therefore we'll be able to provide that good more readily. And also it's cheaper as well because the government is covering part of the cost. Okay, can anyone give me an example of a good or service subsidized by the government? This one might be a bit trickier. I shall give you 5 seconds. Have you heard of anything in the news? I'll give you 5 seconds while I take a sip. Oh, a good one. Yes, you're correct, Warda. Agricultural goods. R&D, yes, you're correct as well, DHL. So, especially in particular industries, right? So kind of like the ones we mentioned in like Innovate UK. So like the digital sector or the startup sector, the government is starting to put more and more money into that. So we'll go into agricultural goods a bit later, which we would cover. So there we go. We've got farm subsidies, right? So I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the large amount of farm subsidies that once cost the EU like 40% of their entire public spending. So it's kind of crazy how much we're spending on farm subsidies. And when you look into who actually benefit from these farm subsidies, we find actual wealthy landowners actually benefit and receive money from these farm subsidies just because they own the land, but not because they're actually farmers. And there's like a requirement of how big the land you own in order to benefit from the subsidy. So this actually helps exclude a lot of farmers that actually require the subsidy in order to help with their living and to keep food prices low. So yeah, farm subsidies or agricultural subsidies, do look into that and be critical of it. But of course, the original idea of having farm subsidies is to, ensure food prices are low and that farmers are supported, which I think it's important as well to be a self-sustainable country, because other countries or developing countries tend to be able to produce food at a much lower price. So if we don't provide subsidies for our own farmers, then we might just be importing these foods entirely instead. So that's farm subsidies. And then we've got electric vehicles. So this is quite a while back. I think some governments still do it now. So they would subsidize for electric vehicles, and they might not charge you as much in terms of taxes. Actually, I've got a question, because like normally if you drive like a motor vehicle that uses petrol, you need to pay petrol duty. So basically, if you're driving electric vehicles, then you'll be avoiding petrol duty, which is good. It's like avoiding tax. So try to do that legally. Okay, effects of subsidies. So subsidies reduce the cost to produce for suppliers, so as we've mentioned. So this would reduce the market price, right? And of course, because now the suppliers will be able to make more profits since part of their cost is reduced, then the supply curve would shift to the right. Yeah, because there'll be more suppliers entering into the market to provide that good. So subsidies will kind of like have the opposite effect compared to taxes. So previously we kind of looked at explaining taxes in a more qualitative way. So now let's try to explain subsidy using the economic diagram. Okay. So this is a supply curve. So we didn't go very in depth into this in the previous slide, but this should help you understand it a little bit more, especially if you haven't covered this at school. So a normal supply curve, if you supply the good at a low price, or if the market price for the good is low, say that at £2, then you won't supply a lot of the good because you won't be able to make a profit from it, or you can make very little profit from it. So if the market price is high, you tend to be able to supply more of the good. So this is called law of supply. Yeah. So if the price is low at £2, you would only supply 4 quantity. And then if the price is high at 4, then you will supply higher quantities. Yeah. Okay, so that's why the supply curve, in this case, a line rather, we tend to assume that's a line, it's upward sloping. So higher prices, more quantity supplied. So if there is a subsidy, then what would happen? So let's say if the government is paying a £1 subsidy, kind of like for bread production. So originally the market price might be £2 for bread, but now for the £1 subsidy from the government, it would be £1, right? So try to figure out what these blanks are. I shall give you 10 seconds. So while you're doing that, let me just draw out the original supply curve. So this is the original supply curve. This is the original supply curve. Okay, so hope you have some thought about it. So if the price is £4 for bread, then after the subsidy, then it should only cost like £3. So if we assume that the subsidy decreases the market price by the amount of the subsidy, then we'd have something like this, right? And if we actually put that on the graph, what happens is that we would have that. So you can see the supply curve is actually shifting to the right. So originally, £2 is 4, right? It's 4 quantity. So this is the point on the original supply curve. But then after the subsidy, it only costs £1, and the suppliers would produce 4 bread. And that's because it's cheaper to produce that piece of bread, right? Similarly, let's say if we take £4 for example, so if the cost of production or the market price for bread is like £4, then as a result, normally there would be 8 pieces of bread supplied in the market. But now, because of the £1 subsidy, we can see that even if the market price is at £3, the producers are still receiving an equivalent of market price equal to £4 because they're receiving £1 from the government, and as a result, they would still be producing 8 pieces of bread. All this talking about bread is making me a bit hungry. Anyway, let's just go back here first. Seems like I don't have a slide for that. So what would happen if the supply curve actually shifts to the right? So if I just draw out the supply and demand, So this is the original supply curve, and then this is the one with the subsidy. So we've moved from here to here. And then this is the normal demand curve, let's say. So as a result, again, the market will operate at the point where supply is equal to demand. Here at this point and at this point. So we can see P is, say, like the original price, because it's the point where the original supply meets the demand, and Q similarly would be the original quantity. And now for S1, we can see that what did I do? Oh, that always happens. Okay, let's do it again. So we can see for S1, actually both the price would have decreased. So the good is actually cheaper, and also that the quantity has increased. So P would decrease from P to P1, and Q would increase from Q to Q1. So that's kind of like the effect of the subsidy in the market. And the distance between the two supply curve would be the amount of the subsidy. So in general, if the government pays money in order to develop greener technologies or more environmentally friendly technologies, we should assume that there is more environmentally friendly technology supplied by the market, and as a result, it should help combat climate change. And also it's cheaper as well, so it would be easier to kind of make use of that technology in terms of financially. Okay, so recently, what would be a very recent example of a subsidy? And of course, we're talking about food again. So Eat Out to Help Out. So if you're not from the UK, Eat Out to Help Out is a policy where the government is paying 50% of the price that we're spending in restaurants in the UK. So it kind of helps to encourage other people to, eat out. And as a result, we can see a lot of people actually benefiting from this. So we can see diners claim 100 million cut price meals. Eat Out to Help Out, however, might have driven coronavirus spike, which is kind of bad. But for those who are still wants to benefit from the scheme, even though that it's ended, we can always go to Wetherspoons or Bills. Just FYI. Yeah. So this would be a type of subsidy. So similar to taxes, subsidies would be shared between consumers and producers in the market. Yeah. So producers and consumers, the area would be slightly different this time. And like I said, we would kind of flip the two around. So let me explain why. PP is the price the producer receives for, let's say, Thai curry in this case, because we're talking about Eat Out to Help Out. So PP is the price producer receives for Thai curry. PE is the original market price for Thai curry. Because it's where demand hits the supply. And PC is the price consumer pays for the curry. Yeah. Okay, so we can see here that the whole vertical amount of the subsidy is actually shared by the increase in per unit price that the producer gains from the subsidy, which is the upper length, and also the consumers are benefiting from a lower market price, which is the lower length. Whereas the entire subsidy is the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So the top area here, the green area, would actually be the producer subsidy. And then the bottom area will be the consumer subsidy. And the reason that it's an area is because the per unit price will be multiplied by the quantity. So it's kind of like the area of a rectangle here. Okay. So if you want to calculate the area and put in actual numbers, you'll be able to calculate the actual subsidy that the producers receive and consumers receive for Thai curries. So you can see here the total amount of subsidy the government has to pay. Let's say if they're paying £2 for each Thai curry consumed, then it would be £2 times the increase in quantity. Not just increase, but the total quantity, right? So £2 per Thai curry times 8 Thai curries, the government needs to pay like £16 for the subsidy of Thai curries. And if we just want to see how much subsidy is received by the producer, then we just look at the vertical distance of the blue area. So in this case, because the producer is receiving, oh no, this is wrong actually. So this should be the consumer, right? Okay. So in this case, the consumer is paying £2 for the Thai curry, but essentially the government, the original price is £3, right? So as a result, we are benefiting £1 per Thai curry from the government. So if we take £1 Thai curry and then we times it by 8, then we'll be saving £8 for the consumers. So that's kind of like the total benefit that the consumers receive from the government for help out to eat out. If Thai curries were £4, which I hope they would be in the future. Okay, why would we want to subsidize stuff? Of course, for particular products, it's important to subsidize. So like education, healthcare, or coronavirus vaccines, you want these to be available as soon as possible and as much as possible because they are beneficial to society, which are called merit goods. Yeah? So we want to subsidize these goods in order to benefit us. So it can come in the form of an investment grant. So we see a lot of grants in the technology sector nowadays to advance our industries, and these different types of innovation would help us keep our markets more competitive in the UK. So it would help the UK economy if it is done correctly. Yeah. So there is of course, a rush to create the coronavirus vaccine, not just because that it saves a lot of lives, but also the country that creates the vaccine will be able to export it to other countries, right? So as a result, they would have an advantage politically and also economically for the country that actually produces the vaccine first. Subsidies can also be like a remedy temporarily, so it can kind of help businesses survive. But of course, if we kind of drag it out, or if we aren't paying subsidies or using them efficiently, then we might end up with the farm subsidies example, right? Where actually a lot of the money isn't going to those that need it, and actually we are helping businesses survive, but they're not actually progressing. Or we're helping a dying industry continuously, which is not competitive, and they would die eventually in the end anyway. So which would kind of like be a waste of government resources. That a good example would be kind of like the steel industry. So it's very unlikely that the steel industry in the UK would become competitive again. However, or in the US as well. So it might not be a good idea for the US to protect jobs just by putting money within the steel industry in order to kind of save jobs in the short term because it might not be sustainable. Okay, and now for more technical stuff. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of elasticity. Oh, and if you guys have any questions, as usual, just pop it in the chat. So elasticity is a concept where we measure how sensitive the market is to a change in the price. So let's say if we talk about elasticity of demand, if we're looking at if the market price increases by £1, how much less of the good would people buy? So if you're buying Thai curries, if you're buying 10 Thai curries at £5, then you've got 10. So these are like Thai curries, curry boxes. If the price increases by 6, then we would buy less, right? Or we would demand less normally because it's more expensive. So the question is, how much does this number drop? Or what is the percentage falling? So if we buy 5, then we would say that the Thai curries, or the demand for Thai curries, is very elastic, or price elastic. Yeah. So if some of the goods are very sensitive to price changes in terms of how we respond with regards to the quantity, this might mean that taxes and subsidies would have different amounts of effectiveness on different types of goods and services. So a small increase in price might cause a very huge drop in quantity. And this can be determined by a few factors, which we would not go in depth into here, but one of which is the number of substitutes. Yeah. So generally, the elasticity for restaurants, because we're talking about eat out to help out, is quite high. So if the restaurant raises prices, the restaurant raises prices, then a lot of less diners would go to the restaurant. But whereas if a restaurant decreases its prices, a lot more diners should go to the restaurant. So that's what it means if it's demand elastic. So this might help explain why Eat Out to Help Out is that popular. Because diners have a lot of alternatives, and having a lot of alternatives to what type of food we eat and what restaurants we dine at might mean that the restaurant or the demand for restaurant food is very elastic. So therefore, if there is a subsidy for food decreasing its price, it would be very effective in the sense that it would get a lot more diners to eat at the restaurant. So for the more technical people, or for those that are revising for their A-level exams in the autumn, this would be kind of like a useful grid to have. So it kind of says that who benefits more or who benefits less from taxes and subsidies given the elasticity of a certain curve. So if I wanted to ask you guys which one restaurants would be, but I guess it's hard for you to tell me in the chat which one it is. But restaurants would actually belong in this grid, right? The Eat Out to Help Out. So let me just put it here. So it would be this grid, because restaurants are relatively elastic, and also we're talking about subsidies, right? So in this case, the consumer actually would benefit less from the subsidy from the producer. So you'll see here in this diagram that the producer subsidy, which is the green area, is kind of like much larger than the consumer subsidy, which is like the blue area. But of course, this is assuming everything else is constant. And whenever we use economic diagrams or economic models, we are drawing a lot of assumptions about the world. So assumptions including things like the government only is subsidizing one type of restaurant, which is not the case. Assumptions like the consumers actually don't care about your previous pricing. So all of these would factor into how much the price the restaurants would charge and how much the consumers and producers would benefit from the subsidy. So we're kind of ignoring all of those factors. But if we ignore all of those factors and assume everything else stays constant, supposedly producers or restaurants would benefit more from the Eat Out to Help Out subsidy than consumers, in the sense that they are taking more money from the government.